you give your child either the capacity to tell you what other information they need, you give them an opportunity to experiment, you give them the opportunity to not believe your authority just because you said it. And this is a way that we start to establish in a family that thinking matters, not cooperation. Now, you can't do this every day for every meal, for every conversation. Sometimes you just got to buckle a kid in a car seat and not discuss why it matters and what they don't like about the buckle. But I do recommend doing this several times a month if you can, because this is what lays the foundation for them to value their own reasoning process.
I'm Debbie Reber, and welcome to Tilt Parenting, a podcast featuring interviews and conversations aimed at inspiring, informing, and supporting parents raising differently wired kids. In a world overflowing with information and complexity, critical thinking isn't just a useful skill, it's an essential life raft. From navigating complex interactions to making informed decisions, our kids need the ability to think critically now more than ever. But what does that really mean? And how can we as parents nurture this skill in our children? I invited author and Brave Writer founder Julie Bogart back to the show to help us answer these questions and to talk about her new book, Becoming a Critical Thinker, a workbook to help students think well in an age of disinformation. In this conversation, we got into so many things. As you'll hear, I could have talked to Julie for hours. But for this episode, you can expect to hear Julie's thoughts on how and why we can foster critical thinking in our children, how considering multiple perspectives and incorporating diverse viewpoints leads to better problem solving, what parents can do to encourage self-awareness, open-mindedness, and curiosity, and so much more. I hope you're familiar with Julie from our last episode, but in case you aren't, here's a little bit more about her. Julie Bogart is known for her common sense parenting and education advice. She's the author of the beloved book, The Brave Learner, which has brought joy and freedom to countless home educators. Her book, Raising Critical Thinkers, offers parents a lifeline in navigating the complex digital world our kids are confronting. And of course, Julie is also the creator of the award-winning innovative online writing program called Brave Writer, now 22 years old and serving 191 countries. But for now, I'm going to stop with the introductions and get to the episode because it's just so good. I hope you enjoy it. Hey, Julie, welcome back to the podcast.
It's so good to be here and nice to see you again.
It's nice to see you too. I'm really excited to get into this. When you were on the show probably a year ago now, maybe more, we talked about moving through writing resistance. And I'm just going to say right now, listeners, that was such a good conversation. I got so much feedback from that. And if you haven't heard it, go back and listen to that. But at the time, I was like, oh, I really want to talk about your work on raising critical thinkers. And that's what we're going to do today. I guess as a way to start, I would love to just talk about the landscape of critical thinking. And I'm curious to know why you are so drawn to that. Why is that the thing that you feel so passionate about sharing with the world?
Yeah, a lot of people assume that it's because of our current political climate or just the contentiousness of this era in history where we're so globally connected and everybody has a say online. But for me, it really did start back in the 1990s. And it did coincide with the dawn of the internet for me. I was participating on a discussion board with other homeschool mothers, women who were very similar to me. We were stay-at-home moms. We were white. We were heterosexual and married. We were of the same political and religious background, largely. And yet we still got into these massive bloodbath fights. Things like, should you be a Pampers parent or have a diaper subscription service for cloth diapers? Should you have a VBAC after you've had a cesarean section? Is it okay to bottle feed your baby? Like all the parenting wars. But then we also argued over doctrinal differences. And sometimes they were such minor hair-splitting differences. And yet I was watching women just go to the mat. Like, my view is right. And I can't believe you have this view. And, in a lot of ways, we were nice to each other, but we would press up against some deeply held conviction. And then instead of there being like a conversation to better understand each other, it would just go into this like, How can you possibly think that? There's all the facts. I've laid them out for you. How are you not seeing the truth? And so what I got interested in was less figuring out what was true. And instead, I was wondering, why does everyone think they're right? How is it that everyone is persuaded that what they think is the correct interpretation of any perspective? And that sort of sent me on a journey of really examining sources of authority, data, loyalty to various membership communities, because a lot of times what clouds your thinking more than any data is the feeling of belonging. You are so well attached to either your family, your church, your temple, your political party, your breastfeeding group, that you can't even hear anything that contradicts it because you are worried about being kicked out. And so it was this kind of dynamic that became really fascinating to me. And I've really been studying it and thinking about it for 30 years.
Wow. I think it's the foreword for your paperback version of Raising Critical Thinkers. You talk about The Vow and some of these documentaries on HBO, which I am so into.
Crack cocaine.
Yes, all the shows about cults. But you talked about starting to think about this in the 90s. Can you give us a temperature check on where we are now with regards to some of, I guess, the threats against being a critical thinker?
Yeah, I mean, I think the internet initiated a whole new way of understanding ourselves. First of all, everyone had access to a public square in the way that we never had before. You can be published right now. Just get a social media account, type some words, and people will read them. And that did not exist in quite the way it does now until the 90s. And really, social media amplified that in the 20s, the 2000s. But what I really was more interested in is, what was the force that created this belief that if I just trotted out what I considered a fact, everyone would fall in line and agree with me? And really what I discovered is it really points back to public education and the structure of school that we inaugurated in the 19th century. Up until public education, really the first public school that we have record of is like in the 1600s, but it didn't become a widespread model until the 19th century. Before that, it was the privileged who had tutors, and there was much more of a personal education, not a standardized one. And in a standardized education, one of the key features is there's a source of authority, and that authority is in the room with you. It's a teacher. They usually are standing while the students are seated. There is an endowed understanding that that person knows more than the people in the seats. And when those students are tested, they are tested in such a way that they should all come up with the same answer. So if you're doing a multiple choice test, the teacher does not ask you, well, why did you pick B and why did she pick C? They say, actually, the answer is A and you're both wrong. Or if you got A, you're correct. And it applies equally to all 30 kids, regardless of their background, their personal experiences, their religious disposition, their socioeconomics, their political party. And because we exclude all the factors of identity, what we start to overvalue is this authoritative perspective of one person. And so what happened online is people were used to this idea that if I cited an authority, we would all look at that authority and go, oh, well, they know more than I do. And we would all fall in line. What we didn't account for is that we have such a variety of authorities. Is it your pastor? Is it mine? Is it your husband? Is it my sister? Is it the PhD at the university? Is it the article I just read in Vogue magazine? Like, what is the authoritative source for this conversation? And are we going to prioritize anecdote and personal experience or research? But is that research unbiased, or is it just called research? Like, these are all questions we don't typically ask. We're learning to ask them better now. I've seen some marked improvements, even while the whole country is polarizing more, but you can see people trying to appeal to a more reasonable analysis, not just assuming because someone said it, it must be true. But it is still very cloudy out there. And to be a critical thinker isn't to have the right source of authority. It's to be self-aware that you are coming with a bias, that you are actually being pushed by a lot of internal factors that make you sometimes automatically discredit something just because you don't want it to be true.
Oh my gosh. What I'm thinking as you're sharing this is I remember reading maybe in the early aughts about the fact that there was a generation of young people, and I don't know if it was the millennials, but going into the workforce, and that they didn't have this inherent skill of being a creative problem solver. Like they weren't asking the right questions. And so this seems like a separate thing, but not having the critical thinking skills. And so why is it so important? You've kind of talked about it in broad terms, but why is it so critical that our kids grow up to be critical thinkers?
So first, creative problem solving is directly related to critical thinking because you have to be able to shed your fixed understanding in order to be creative. Creativity, by definition, means that you are ejecting yourself from habits of knowing and thinking. And so one of the powers of creative problem solving is the capacity to take yourself out of that habitual way of looking at something. So for creative problem solving, you are automatically a critical thinker. Critical thinking, the reason it matters is because we cannot problem solve through conversion. And you mentioned cults at the beginning of this. Religions, cults, political parties have adopted a conversion mentality. Even corporations have what they would call their evangelists, right? The people who go out and shill, for Procter & Gamble or for Johnson & Johnson. Why do they do that? Because we've been trained in a model for generations that revival is what saves us. If we can all get on the same page, then we'll all finally have this kumbaya moment where we will have the correct solutions and they will apply to the entire community. What we've discovered through the internet, through immigration, through globalization, is that we are too interconnected now to sort of become these small units, what we might have called a tribe or a nation state or a community. We are too interconnected with people who are not members of our group. And the conversion model fails over and over again. It'll win some people, but it can never win everyone. So what we end up having is we have these high stakes arguments where I'm saying, hey, my little, smaller, non-majority community is being run over by the values of your larger community. And the larger community is saying, just get with the program, just get with the program. And the minority community is saying, but my needs, my rights, the things that I value are being eliminated from this conversation. So I'm going to put a stake in the ground and just ruin all of your plans. That's what they do. What we really want is the capacity to imagine that there are multiple points of view that have value on any given issue. And then we want to creative problem solve in a way that accounts for as many of those views as we possibly can. So I love to use gun rights as a really good example because we often have polarizing views about that. What would happen if our gun policy included the experiences and knowledge of a police officer, of a security guard, of a victim of gun violence, of a handgun owner, of the person who sells guns, of the people who have been victims of a mass shooting? Like, what would happen if we actually listened to a hunting enthusiast, right? Or somebody who's fought in the military, and we brought all of those perspectives to the table, and we didn't automatically devalue the ones that didn't align with us, but we thought, well, what do they bring to the table in this conversation? How can we incorporate the claims they have? Sometimes it's very challenging to do. We're experiencing that with the abortion issue right now. But by bringing more viewpoints to the table and trying to imagine a world that includes more viewpoints, we actually get to better policy. And that's just in a political arena. We can drill down to like what to do in a family because that's where we start.
Yes. And the way you're describing that, when you think about this conversation on raising critical thinkers, that really it's creating bridges and connection as opposed to you might hear the word critical thinker and think that you're going to be like very dismissive or critical of other points of view, but that's not what we're talking about at all.
No, I'm so glad you brought that up because the idea of being a critical thinker in most people's minds is, hey, I can find fault in the other guy's thinking. And then it's a gotcha moment. right? And it's really funny because I've done, several years of podcast interviews now about this topic. And I've been interviewed by many men. Men weren't interested in my homeschool stuff, but they got very interested in critical thinking. And I have been interviewed by both ends of the political spectrum. And they always think that their group is the critical thinkers. And they think I'm their ally to pull in the other side. And I find it so humorous. It's sort of like we all think we're good drivers. And clearly that can't be true. There are accidents every day. I know I'm not a good driver. I've been in too many accidents, but it's having the self-awareness to recognize that your perspective is limited. Like if you got behind the eyes of the person you disagree with most, if you had their life experiences, their traumas, their opportunities, their relationships, you would be drawing their conclusions. They are not lacking information. We're lacking the information that helps us understand the way they compose their worldview.
So I do want to pivot and talk about the family, and then we have to get into your workbook as well. We're going to take a quick break, and then we'll do that. Maybe I've watched too many seasons of The Amazing Race, but every time I have to go somewhere on the subway, I treat it like a competition. It's all about making the right gut decisions about which route will get me there the fastest. Sometimes those decisions get me where I'm going early, and other times my gambles don't really pay off. Probiotics can't help with most gut decisions, but if your gut needs a little support, Ritual has your back. Their Synbiotic Plus, a 3-in-1 supplement, has clinically studied prebiotics, probiotics, and a postbiotic to support a balanced gut microbiome. I've been using Synbiotic Plus for about 6 months now, and it's become a core part of my morning routine. I take the mini capsule every morning while making my way through my inbox, whether I'm at home or I'm on the road, because it doesn't need to be refrigerated. And the capsule itself is delayed released, which helps it survive the harsh conditions of the upper GI tract for delivery to the colon, and that's exactly where we want it to go. Ritual invested in a study modeling the human colon, which showed that Synbiotic Plus significantly increased microbial diversity and the growth of beneficial bacteria. There's no more shame in your gut game. Synbiotic Plus and Ritual are here to celebrate, not hide your insides. Get 25% off your first month for a limited time at ritual.com/tilt. Start Ritual or add Synbiotic Plus to your subscription today. That's ritual.com/tilt for 25% off. During this month of planning and organization for big transitions, rhythms and routines have been absolutely essential for our physical and emotional well-being. So Green Chef nights are reliably and predictably a good night. We know the ingredients will be fresh and prepped, the instructions easy to follow, and the meal delicious. We're all still talking about last week's turkey tacos with mango chimichurri sauce, refried beans, and Monterey Jack cheese. Green Chef contributes to a healthy lifestyle with easy and delicious menus like fresh seasonal salads and grain bowls. And with over 80 weekly meal and market options, plus rotating options to suit a variety of lifestyles, whether Mediterranean, plant-based, calorie-smart, keto, protein-packed, gluten-free, there are always plenty of options to choose from. Whatever you select, you'll get farm-fresh ingredients, organic whole fruits and veggies, and premium proteins, all delivered straight to your door. I love those 4 words. Straight to my door. Oh, and one more thing I love about Green Chef, they have an app, which means it's easy to manage meal preferences and delivery from your phone if you want to. And I, for one, want to. I am in that mode where I'm making the most of little moments like waiting in line at the pharmacy or for the F train to pull into the station to tackle all of those to-dos. So the convenience of an app is key for me. Green Chef has a special offer for Tilt listeners. Go to greenchef.com/tilt50 and use code TILT50 to get 50% off plus 20% off your next 2 months. That's 50% off plus 20% off your next 2 months when you use the code TILT50 at greenchef.com/tilt50. Just to circle back then, within the family, I'm wondering what parents do that gets in the way or interferes with what we're doing here and our goal of raising critical thinkers.
Okay, so I'm so glad this is where we're going next because this is the fun part of the conversation for me. So think about the ways that you talk to your children currently. Back when I was raising kids in the 80s and 90s, the thinking was that children needed to do what their parents asked them to do, to obey, to cooperate quickly. And if they didn't, then they needed to be persuaded with some kind of punishment, spanking or a timeout or some kind of talking to or a limit on screen time. It was very punitive. So the next generation, my kids' age, maybe yours, they came along and they're like, yeah, we don't like that model. We really want our children to understand why they have to cooperate. And so now what parents do is they lecture their children. And here's what I think is really funny. Cooperation to me is just the word we use for manipulative obedience. What we're basically saying is, do what I say. Oh, you don't want to? Now I'm going to indoctrinate you into my reasoning. In the old strategy, it was just like, recognize authority. The authority wins, you lose. Now it's, I'm going to talk you into agreeing with me, which is actually undermining a power of critical thinking. So here's an example of what it might look like to foster it rather than lecture. So let's say it's time for dinner. You've got a 7-year-old child. You say to that child, hey, go wash your hands. We're getting ready for dinner. And this child who has routinely washed their hands suddenly says, yeah, I don't want to. Now, what a parent in today's life might do is say, oh, honey, you've got to. You've been playing all day. You've got germs all over your hands. If you eat food and eat the germs, it'll make you sick. This is what science tells us. Please go wash your hands. Okay, so that's basically saying you don't know yourself and you don't know the right information. So I'm going to power over your experience and tell you the information that you should value so that you'll do what I value. That is a conversion mentality. A critical thinking mentality would pause and ask a curious question. Oh, you washed your hands easily yesterday. You don't want to now. What's going on? Now, your child could have a variety of reactions. So I'm just going to pick a couple and show you how I might work with this answer. So the child might say, I don't like the water. And so now the question is, oh, this is no longer about germs. The child just doesn't like the water. So you can come over and say to that child, is it the temperature? And you might get a thermometer and figure out what temperature the child prefers. You might discover they don't like their hands to be wet. So you suggest hand sanitizer. Now they don't like it to be sticky. So maybe you do a little research and you find out that you could just blow dry their hands with a blow dryer, no water, and kill the germs with heat, right? So you could experiment, explore, find out how their experience impacts this conversation. But what if your child actually doesn't really know? Maybe they're just busy playing and they don't want to stop. Could you, the next time, start the process earlier? Because maybe it has nothing to do with germs. But here's the final thing I want to say. Kids make us interrogate our own beliefs if we really stop to think about it. Because maybe that lecture about germs isn't landing because your child saw you yesterday in Target with your toddler who spit out a pacifier that landed on the ground, that you picked up, sucked the germs off of with your own mouth, and popped it back in that baby's mouth. How much do you believe your theology around germs? Is this just a belief you've picked up uncritically and you're passing it on as almost like folklore, but it isn't actually based on your beliefs around germs? Could you just roll the dice and say to your child, you know what? We don't always wash our hands before food. You're right. I'm willing to take a risk. Are you? Let's see how it goes for a week. In other words, you give your child either the capacity to tell you what other information they need. You give them an opportunity to experiment. You give them the opportunity to not believe your authority just because you said it. And this is a way that we start to establish in a family that thinking matters, not cooperation. Now, you can't do this every day for every meal, for every conversation. Sometimes you just got to buckle a kid in a car seat and not discuss why it matters and what they don't like about the buckle. But I do recommend doing this several times a month if you can, because this is what lays the foundation for them to value their own reasoning process.
Such a great example. And of course, as you're saying that, I hear my dad's voice saying, because I said so, which was like the mantra of my youth and probably many listeners here as well.
Yes.
And it's also making me think of Alfie Kohn's work in Unconditional Parenting. When I read that book, and I think Ash was maybe 9, and I was like, oh my gosh, why? Why do I care about this? And why is this the hill I'm going to die on when I have no idea why I'm even making this an important issue in our life?
100%. And the thing is, they're going to keep having views you don't have. So when we start with like a 5 or a 7-year-old, where we're actually giving some dignity to their own self-representation, even if it's limited by their youth, their immaturity, and their lack of experience, you are teaching them how to investigate why they even have that reaction, so that by the time they're 16 and they're arguing with you about staying out past midnight or driving downtown without supervision, you're having a conversation from the place of problem solving, not cooperating with a parent's set of fears, right? And it changes the playing field for what it means to take responsibility, to have agency, to think through your own claims.
I love that you use the word dignity. That's just such an important word when we think about the way we're raising our kids. And I just like to associate that with parenting and childhood. One more question on this, and then we'll take a quick break and we're really going to get into your workbook. But I just want to ask, especially in this climate, there seems to be a growing backlash against gentle parenting or parenting that is very focused on prioritizing what we're talking about today, really. And so I'm just wondering your thoughts on that and why some parents feel so threatened by what we're talking about.
It's so challenging to raise children. We have this baby placed in our arms who we immediately picture as a grown-up fulfilling our dreams of living out an unlived life of our own, right? This is a clean slate person. And we get very attached to the idea that we're going to give our child the advantages we didn't get. Even if we were pretty advantaged, those parents want at least as good as what they got. And so what ends up happening is we become propaganda machines for our own vision of what we imagine our child will be. And we get to that vision through a variety of parenting dynamics. Some people are attracted to that gentle attachment parenting style. Others are more to the resiliency, personal agency, free-ranging, whatever. All of that is about a parental fantasy. It's not actually about the child. And so part of what I hope parents come to when they look at my work and they read Raising Critical Thinkers, or they do these activities in becoming a critical thinker with their teens, is to just become more self-aware of their own agenda. We come with an agenda and we are attracted to parenting styles based on that agenda. It's not because those parenting styles are pure. It's because they meet some fantasy that we've erected almost unconsciously about our children. And so being willing to get with reality. You know, I did a reel this week that was saying, you think you know your children, but you don't. Who they become is not who you thought they were at age 10. And that form just keeps shape-shifting. I remember my mother worrying about my sister one time. My sister was in her 50s. And she was worried about something. And she was worried the way a mother worries. And I paused and I said, oh my gosh. You mean this does not end? I'm still going to be trying to help my kid at 50 to land on their feet. And she's like, yeah, no, that never stops. And, it's true. When I went through my divorce, who did I call? My mother. Who helped me through it? My mother. So I think part of it is letting go of this idea that we're going to raise these indomitable, fail-safe adults. If we can get with that, we will be a lot further along on the program.
Well, I did watch your reel when you released it on Instagram, the one you just referenced. And I was like, oh my God, she is speaking to me. I needed to hear that message so much. So thank you for that. I'll have a link in the show notes. You guys should check it out. And also check out Julie's Instagram in general, because you do so much great content on there. Let's take a quick break, and then we're going to talk about your new workbook for kids. Hey there, it's Debbie. I love making this show and sharing conversations about how to support our awesome neurodivergent kids. I've seen how even one little insight from an interview can spark a big shift in daily life. But I know that raising complex kids can be messy and lonely. And just when we think we figured it out, something comes up that boots us right back to feeling overwhelmed and stuck. That's why I've poured everything into creating a way for parents like us navigating complex parenting journeys to join together and chart a path that feels positive, hopeful, and doable. It's the brand new Differently Wired Club experience. In the club, you'll get personal support from me and other seasoned parent coaches, 6 live calls every month where you can connect and get your personal questions answered, the opportunity to learn directly from authors and experts like I have on this show, monthly themes for getting specific and tactical, an exclusive private podcast feed, and the best, most generous community of parents. Seriously, these folks show up for themselves and each other, and that right there is really everything. Because it's a daily reminder that we're not alone. Our kids aren't broken, and we have totally got this. The recently rebooted Differently Wired Club is on a brand new platform with its very own iOS and Android app. It is such a great space. However you learn, whatever your style, no matter the ages, genders, and neurodivergent profile of your children, the Differently Wired Club can help you cultivate the positive shifts you're hoping for. Join us today by going to tiltparenting.com/club. That's tiltparenting.com/club. I hope to see you on the inside.
Are you overwhelmed by the things that get in the way of you doing what you want to do? Are you looking for ways to simplify life to better align with your values? Do you want to create space in your schedule so you have room for more of the good stuff? Play, joy, relationships, gratitude, and more? If you answered yes to any of these questions, I invite you to check out Edit Your Life, a podcast to help you edit the unnecessary from your life so you have more room to enjoy the awesome. Through episodes with me, Christine Coe, and a range of super smart, compassionate, and thoughtful guests, you'll come away with big picture insights and practical ways to declutter your home, schedule, and mental space without getting bogged down by perfection. I have always believed that small moments and actions matter tremendously. My goal is to help you find agency and space in your life through doable baby steps that will leave you feeling accomplished instead of overwhelmed. Check out Edit Your Life wherever you enjoy your podcasts.
You have a brand new book out. It is for kids. Oh, she's holding it up. It is called Becoming a Critical Thinker, a workbook to help students think well in an age of disinformation. So can you tell us about that book and why you put it out there and who it's for?
Yeah, it's a good story. My publisher was so thrilled with the success of Raising Critical Thinkers. We didn't know how that book would do, and it's just been crushing. It's been going great. And they said, well, what about a workbook for students? And I actually laughed. I said, I am the queen of anti-workbooks. We do not have them in my company, Brave Writer. I don't like workbooks. So we had kind of a conversation about it. And they said, well, what if you wrote a workbook that you would use? Or something that felt more like a journal. And they gave me a couple of examples in their catalog line. And I was like, oh, this I can picture. So it's called a workbook, but really it's like a journal. And basically what I've done is I've taken the practices that I included in Raising Critical Thinkers, and I rewrote them for teens, made them very clear for 12 to 18-year-olds. And there's space to write in, bubbles to fill in, rankings, columns, all different formats for writing. And then I added a slew of additional activities that are not in Raising Critical Thinkers. And I broke it down into 3 sections so that our kids can really learn how to be good critical thinkers. So the first part is called the Foundation, Understanding Critical Thinking. Then the second part is the practice, growing your thinking skills. And part 3 is the application, learning the art of interpretation. So we go from learning what it is to growing those skills to applying it so that you can make good interpretations of any information that comes your way. And these activities include things like movie reviews, eavesdropping on coffeehouse conversations, talking about the silent films of ideas that are in our minds that shape how we think, taking an academic selfie, flipping the camera lens around on your own mind and examining the way that you form your worldview, how to identify red flags in data, all that kind of stuff. So it's really oriented towards that emerging academic mind. And my thought is, if you do this in high school, junior high and high school, your kids will be so far ahead of the curve in college, you just won't believe it. Because these are the kinds of skills that I was taught in grad school, right? I don't know why we don't trust our teens with more self-awareness and critical thinking tools. We tend to think they need to be stuffed with viewpoints and information rather than getting them to investigate and comment on the meaning they're generating from that information, because that's the foundation of critical thinking.
Yeah. As you're saying that, I'm thinking about this idea of media literacy, right? And that was kind of the thing in like the 90s or even the 80s when I was at university, late 80s. And I remember watching Killing Me Softly about sexualized portrayals of women in advertisement. And that like blew my mind, right? That was it. Like that was the conversation. I was like, wow, I need to look at things more differently. Okay, check. As I was reading your workbook, I was definitely feeling like this is so robust. This feels like a course to me. Is it a course? Like, could you see this as something that parents would like roll out over a semester or schools?
Absolutely. It's got 32 activities in it, and they each can take a week to do. Some will take longer. So you could easily use this for an entire school year. And I think it should be essential learning in any school year. Now, parents have often asked me, do you buy more than one if you have more than one teen? And I mean, of course, that would be wonderful. I'd love you to do that. Or you can use the workbook as a textbook and have them do the writing on their own sheets of paper. What I do know about teens is they very much love writing in books. They love having their own tool, something that is their own possession. So if you have a teen like that, then buy an individual copy for them. I've also had parents ask me, can I do the workbook for my own development? And that is 100% yes from me. These activities might at times seem like they're oriented to teens because I was trying to find social issues that they care about, but you care about them, particularly if you have a teen. So in my view, it would be just as powerful for an adult as for a young adult.
Agreed. I especially loved lesson 8. There was a lesson called How the New Media Pushes Viewpoints. And I was a broadcast journalism major in undergrad. I was really into like ethics and news. Like that was my thing. Like, should we have music in a news show?
Great question.
Right?
Yes.
Like, what does that do? So I loved that you included that here. Of course, back then, if I could have flash forwarded to see where we are today, I would have been horrified. Take us inside that a little bit. What would you want, for example, kids to know about the news that they consume?
Yeah, so it's funny, we all have our formative moments. You talked about your one with the women's sexual assault in the media. For me, I remember being an exchange student in France in college. And one of the activities we did when we were working on learning French, I knew some French, but I was a student and I was still learning it. They had us have 4 different newspapers from France, and we had to analyze the headlines of the front page of each one and see if we could come up with what angle, what viewpoint was being conveyed in this language that was not natural to us. So it was very difficult to know, are they pushing a viewpoint, and is it more conservative or more liberal or more progressive? And that really struck me. And because we did it in a foreign language, it had a bigger impact. And so when I went back to the States, I noticed language and headlines in ways I never had before in English. And of course, we fast forward, and now we've got chyrons telling us what to think about while we're listening to a talking head on a news show. We've got all different news media websites and apps giving us like information in sound bites and in Twitter and in threads. And so, yeah, it's even more essential now that we get to know how we are being shaped, how we are being pushed toward a viewpoint, or even held back from having a viewpoint. That's equally powerful in those headlines. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the lessons you have is on perspective taking and tolerance and deconstructing familiar stories. As I'm reading that, I'm wondering about some of the additional challenges in doing this for neurodivergent kids who may have more distorted thinking, may be more negative in the way they see the world, may have more kind of rigid or fixed ways of seeing the world. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on how to help those kids who are really like ground in, deconstruct ideas that might kind of keep them closed off from accepting other points of view.
One of my favorite methods for perspective taking is acting, literally acting. So having a student memorize lines and learn how to go into character for someone who is not them is a way for them to experience the reality that there is an entirely different embodied experience in a different person. So instead of trying to get them to understand your viewpoint, have them try to understand what it was like to be, Ophelia, to be a character who has a viewpoint that is unique to that person. The thing that's nice about acting is that it allows you to inhabit a perspective without it threatening the fact that you have one. So you get to inhabit it, but there's this nice bright line between your identity and the perspective that you are adopting for the sake of acting. And why I like that is because usually when we're asking kids to take perspectives, we're asking them to be more empathetic. And when you are asking someone to be empathetic, you're asking them to let go of their strongly held position long enough to extend empathy. And that feels very threatening to certain temperaments. There are some people who, when they make that exchange, they feel lost, they feel overlooked. Neurodivergent kids actually have a more limited capacity to do that. But what I've discovered is that if you can help them feel this shift, like I'm going to take on this other role, this other kind of person, and just see what that feels like, knowing they can safely retreat to themselves, you start to show them the world in a more complex way.
Yeah, so interesting. My husband was an actor and is neurodivergent. And now that you're saying that, like, that's why he started going into acting in high school, because it helped him make sense of the world. I so appreciate that.
That's really incredible. And I think you can do it in the less formal ways, right? Like you can play act with your child a debate. Pretend that you believe in X. How can you defend that? And what would be the kinds of experiences a person would have that would support X? It's very tricky to do. One of the places that I did it when I was in adulthood, I was an actress when I was young, but as an adult, I got interested because of the internet in trying to understand opposing viewpoints. So if I took a very strong stand on a position like abortion, I won't share which position I had at the time, but I remember reading somewhere and they said, well, this side of the argument has the moral high ground. And I was like, no, they don't. I have the moral high ground. They should know that they don't. But that statement was so alarming to me. I thought, maybe I've never read that position from someone who believes it's the moral high ground. Maybe I need to at least start with how they see their position, not how my position sees their position. And that sent me on a multi-year search. I started reading everything I could. And over time, I felt like I had such a much wider picture of the whole issue. And that's what it means to grow empathy. It's not in one conversation. It's the willingness to put yourself in an uncomfortable place where you are willing to believe that the other actor is rational. You can get inside their skin and trace down the interior logic. It doesn't mean you agree. It just means given everything they know and who they are, their viewpoint logically coheres. It's a pretty high level skill. A lot of adults don't have it, but I have been really encouraged by how teens can get there when they're given the right tools because they are not as fixed in their thinking as adults.
Yeah, I would say that's true. In conversations I've had with my 19-year-old about current events, he's taken me inside some of the discourse that's happening on Discord about these issues. And I'm pleasantly surprised at how they're talking about things and communicating with very divergent backgrounds and ideas, but they're doing it. So that's kind of cool.
Amazing. That really encourages me, honestly. And just remember, any viewpoint you had at 15, I mean, how many of us hold the same exact views we had at 15? People evolve. So they're going to test their ideas. One of my kids had a really strong view about a ballot issue in Ohio when he was 15, and he wasn't old enough to vote. So he kind of put together almost a PowerPoint level argument with me, like went through, he did all his research. He had all these articles. He was showing me where to read. And we had this long talk and I was very affirming. I'm like, you did such an impressive job. You know this idea so well. He said, so are you going to vote pro? I said, I'm voting con. And his eyes squirted tears. And he said, Mom, I count on you to be logical. And I started laughing and I said, honey, I appreciate everything that you just expressed. And probably by the time you're an adult, this issue will change. But you never accounted for my position. And my position is still this, and it has its logical coherence to it, even though you don't want me to hold it. But I think we can have a good conversation even when we don't see it the same way. And interestingly enough, he's in his 30s now, so double the age. And he has much more capacity to see what my concerns were. But I also have much more capacity to appreciate why his position mattered in the larger marketplace, because it was an early debate that has flowered over the last 15 years. So these are things to keep in mind, that you're not having the last conversation with your child every time something comes up where you don't agree.
So great. All right. I want to recap. Your book is called Becoming a Critical Thinker, a workbook to help students think well in an age of disinformation. There's so much that we haven't gotten into today. It is, as I said before, very robust, literally like a whole course and curriculum. What would you want listeners to take away from this and make sure that they know about this book and about this larger conversation?
I feel like we're on the path to really reforming how we understand education. And part of that is because of the rise of artificial intelligence, which is throwing the best monkey wrench into education that we've had in 2 centuries. And when I say that, I mean it with all sincerity. There are reasons to be afraid of AI, but what I think AI is telling us is the rote skills that we thought schooling was about are less important today. And what really matters is original thinking, critical thinking, problem solving. These large language models like Gemini and ChatGPT, they issue 1.7 million hallucinations a day. A hallucination is an error in fact. So when your kids go to use these tools for starter text or to help them compose essays, if they don't know how to vet information, if they don't know how to track it down, make sure it's accurate, understand the nuances, and argue to defend it, they are going to struggle in college and even in high school. This is not an argument about whether or not we should let AI write our papers. It's actually, how will this tool either empower or disempower thinking? And my hope is that it will be like Photoshop was to photographers. It will actually empower good thinking. So to me, in an age where artificial intelligence is coming like a tidal wave, it is essential to train your kids in how to think well, how to vet sources, how to understand data and research, and how to be the kinds of contributors to the future of the world that take into account a wide variety of perspectives, not just their own groups.
Yeah, I was really happy to see you end the workbook with the conversation about OpenAI and ChatGPT, and I was very curious to see your take on it. So I love that you're not talking about it as something to fear. And in fact, how can we use this as a tool? Because it's not going away. So I love that viewpoint.
I always joke with people who are afraid of it. I have 2 things I like to say. I say, be afraid of the nuclear bomb. That we were capable of creating that, and we've already dropped it twice, atom bombs. So if we have something to truly fear, it's weaponry. That's the thing that humans are capable of that is so destructive. But then the other thing I like to say is parents and adults were very afraid of the internet, what it would do to education, the rise in pornography online, all of that. And all of those things came to pass, and we're still all on the internet. AI is here. It has its limits. It needs its guardrails. We will have policy. The EU has already started to institute guidelines to kind of rein it in, but we are not going to avoid it. It is here. And so my aim is to take somewhat of a technological optimistic view like Herman Kahn, where the problems technology creates, technology can solve. And that is kind of my way of coping with this massively influential tool that is not going away. It is here.
Well, thank you, Julie. This has been such a fascinating conversation, not just for me. I'm sure my listeners are going to get so much out of this. Congratulations on the book. And where would you like listeners to go to check out your work?
Thank you. Yeah, if you go to raisingcriticalthinkers.com, that's where you'll see both Raising Critical Thinkers and Becoming a Critical Thinker, links, downloads, all that kind of stuff. And then for my writing company, bravewriter.com is where we sell writing curriculum, and we teach this kind of thinking in our online writing classes. So if you're looking for sort of breakthrough level writing classes for your students, it would be a great place. The classes run 3 to 6 weeks. They're not like semester length, and they work really well, whether you homeschool or use traditional schooling models. And then finally, I am on Instagram at Julie Bravewriter.
Awesome. Well, thank you again. Such a great conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Debbie.
You've been listening to the Tilt Parenting Podcast. To learn more about today's guest and the resources we talked about, check out the extensive show notes page on Tilt Parenting. There you'll find key takeaways, links to all the resources mentioned, and even a full transcript of our conversation. Just go to tiltparenting.com/podcast and select this episode. If you're looking for personal support from me and connection with the phenomenal community of parents raising neurodivergent kids, join us in the recently rebooted Differently Wired Club. The new Differently Wired Club can help you cultivate the positive shifts you're hoping for. Go to tiltparenting.com/club to learn more. The Tilt Parenting Podcast is hosted by me, Debbie Reber, author of Differently Wired and the founder of Tilt Parenting, and was edited by Andrea Curtis Amasquita. To support this show, please join my Patreon campaign where you can set up a small monthly contribution. Just go to patreon.com/tiltparenting to learn more. If you want to follow Tilt on social media, you can find us at @tiltparenting on Instagram and Facebook. And lastly, please take a minute to leave a 5-star rating or review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. That helps this show stay visible so others can find it more easily. And that's all for this week. Stay safe, stay well, and take good care. And for more information about any of the parenting resources Tilt offers, visit tiltparenting.com.
Hey, are you a parent of a teenager? Are you feeling overwhelmed about how to be what they need while also holding limits and boundaries that keep them safe? Are you tired of conversations that negate how messy this season of parenting is? Well, I've got you. My name is Casey O'Rourke. I am a positive discipline trainer, parent coach, and the host of the Joyful Courage podcast. Every week, I come to you with an interview digging into tough topics with experts I trust and solo shows that go deep into the personal growth and mindset needed to raise teens in a way that grows them into confident, capable young people. I am not afraid of getting real about the intersection of conscious parenting and the teen years, while also bringing in vulnerability, humor, and lightness. I'm walking the path with you and honored to serve. Listen to Joyful Courage on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you consume podcasts.